October 1962 started out angry. Rioting had broken out at the previously segregated University of Mississippi, where James Meredith, accompanied by U.S. Marshals, became the first Black American enrolled at the university. As protests became more violent, federal marshals were brought into the area to restore order. On October 1st, a mob assaulted the marshals and set fire to property. As the crowd of protesters reached 3,000, President Kennedy called in reinforcements from the Army. When it was over, 55 federal agents and 40 soldiers had been injured, and 2 bystanders killed. With all the trouble in Mississippi, many Americans may not have noticed that a new comedian named Johnny Carson had taken over The Tonight Show, which he'd go on to host for 33 years. Or that a new movie hero was born, as the first James Bond film was released. 25 more would follow. Or that a little-known British band called The Beatles had released their first record, and would revolutionize pop music over the next 8 years. But even greater changes began on the evening of October 22nd, when President Kennedy announced the presence of Russian missile bases in Cuba.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The country was stunned. For years, Americans had lived with a nightmarish prospect of a nuclear war with Russia. Now it seemed the president was provoking the Soviet Union and risking the chance of starting that war. But the president had few options. Back on October 14th, a U.S. reconnaissance plane had photographed a missile site under construction in western Cuba. Later flights detected 4 more missile sites, and Russian technicians could be seen working around the clock to set them up. Russia's foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, met with Kennedy but said nothing about the missiles. Russia was only supplying defensive weapons to Cuba, Gromyko said, but Kennedy had already seen photos of the missile bases. He weighed his options with his executive committee. They were only days away from the missile sites being operational. Faced with the U.S. naval embargo, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev hesitated, then ordered some ships to stop and others to turn back. As reported in the Post, Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." But there were still missiles in Cuba, and once they were operational, there'd be no room for negotiating. On Friday, the 26th, Kennedy received a rambling letter from Khrushchev about the need to end the crisis. But the next day, a different message came out of Moscow. Khrushchev now demanded the U.S. remove its missile bases in Turkey. Kennedy rejected the idea, and the administration was back where it started. By now, Americans were approaching panic as the possibility of war became greater. The stalemate hadn't been broken. Nobody had backed down. At any minute, the skies might be filled with Soviet bombers or missiles fired from Cuba. Sensing that Khrushchev was also trying to back away from the situation, Bobby Kennedy made a suggestion. He told his brother John, respond to Khrushchev's Friday letter as if he had proposed an acceptable deal, that Russia would remove its missiles, Kennedy would stop the blockade, and not direct any military action against Cuba, and he'd agreed to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev quickly accepted, and the world sighed in relief at avoiding a nuclear war. Having come through the crisis, Kennedy was reminded of President Lincoln, who had celebrated the end of the Civil War by making his fatal trip to Ford's Theater. Joking darkly with brother Bobby, John Kennedy said, "Maybe this is the night I should go to the theater." And Bobby said, "If you go, I want to go with you."
This video is brought to you by the Saturday Evening Post Digital Archives. For only $15 a year, you can explore 200 years of American history in the Saturday Evening Post online archives. Subscribe today.